In 2016, economists Matthew Gibson and Jeffrey Schrader published a paper that received almost no attention outside of academic circles, despite containing one of the most striking findings in the economics of personal behavior in recent years. They had analyzed data from a large natural experiment. The fact that people living on the western edge of a time zone get naturally darker evenings and therefore tend to go to sleep earlier and get more sleep than people living on the eastern edge of the same time zone, even though both groups wake up at roughly the same clock time for work. The sleep difference between the eastern and western edges is small, on average about 19 minutes per night. But the income difference was not small at all. The researchers estimated that an extra hour of sleep per night was associated with a 16% increase in wages in the short run and a 21% increase in the long run. 19 minutes of additional sleep, at the scale they were measuring, was associated with meaningful and consistent differences in economic outcomes. This finding was not an isolated curiosity. It was a data point in what has become, over the past decade, a substantial body of research linking sleep quality and duration to financial outcomes, not through the obvious channel of health and productivity, but through a more specific and more interesting channel: the effect of sleep on financial decision-making, risk assessment, impulse control, and the capacity for the kind of deliberate, future-oriented thinking that building wealth requires. The research, taken together, makes a case that is genuinely difficult to dismiss. Sleep is not just a health issue. It is a financial issue, and the relationship between wealth and sleep runs in both directions, which means that the sleep-wealth gap is one of the mechanisms by which financial inequality compounds itself over time. Let us begin with what happens to financial decision-making in the sleep-deprived brain, because the neuroscience here is specific enough to be genuinely illuminating. Sleep deprivation, defined in most of the relevant research as less than 6 hours per night, produces effects on the prefrontal cortex that are, by now, well established in the neuroimaging literature. The prefrontal cortex, as we have discussed in this series, is the region of the brain most associated with executive function, long-term planning, impulse control, rational deliberation, the capacity to override immediate emotional impulses in favor of considered responses. Sleep deprivation degrades prefrontal cortical function in ways that are measurable, significant, and specifically relevant to financial behavior. A landmark study by Els van der Helm and Matthew Walker at the University of California, Berkeley found that sleep-deprived participants were significantly less able to make rational economic decisions in a series of financial games. Specifically, they showed increased susceptibility to the kind of short-term thinking and impulse-driven choices that the sleep-deprived prefrontal cortex is less equipped to override. They also showed increased emotional reactivity, stronger negative responses to financial losses, stronger positive responses to financial gains, suggesting that the amygdala, the brain's emotional response center, was operating with less regulatory oversight from the sleep-impaired prefrontal cortex. The combination of impaired long-term thinking and heightened emotional reactivity to financial outcomes is, in the language of this research series, almost a definition of bad financial decision-making. The Uppsala University study that we mentioned briefly in the cortisol video deserves more attention here. The researchers, led by Colin Chapman, used a sophisticated experimental design in which participants were tested twice, once after a full night of sleep and once after a night of sleep deprivation, and asked to complete a series of financial decision tasks, including simulated shopping, investment choices, and savings allocation decisions. The sleep-deprived condition produced significantly higher rates of impulsive purchasing, significantly lower rates of saving allocation, and significantly worse performance on investment tasks that required integrating information over time. The researchers calculated that a single night of poor sleep produced effects on financial decision-making that were roughly equivalent to a moderate alcohol intoxication, a comparison that, when you understand the neurobiological mechanism, is not as surprising as it initially sounds. The alcohol comparison is instructive because it points toward a specific mechanism. Both alcohol and sleep deprivation disinhibit behavior by reducing prefrontal cortical oversight of the limbic system. Both make the immediate more salient and the future less real. Both increase susceptibility to social and emotional influences on behavior. And both produce a state in which people reliably underestimate the effects they are experiencing. The sleep-deprived person like the mildly drunk person, tends to believe they are functioning better than they are. This metacognitive impairment, the inability to accurately assess your own cognitive state, is one of the reasons that sleep deprivation's effects on financial behavior are so insidious. People making bad financial decisions while sleep-deprived do not, in most cases, recognize that their sleep state is affecting their judgment. Now here is where the story becomes specifically about wealth, rather than just about decision-making quality. The relationship between sleep and wealth does not operate only through the channel of individual decision-making. It also operates through the channel of what economists call human capital, the productivity, creativity, social effectiveness, and judgment that determine economic outcomes in the labor market and in entrepreneurial ventures. And the research on sleep and human capital is, if anything, even more striking than the research on sleep and individual financial decisions. A study by Christopher Barnes at the University of Washington, who has probably published more research on sleep and workplace outcomes than any other researcher currently working, found that leaders who slept less than 6 hours per night were rated by their subordinates as significantly less charismatic, less inspiring, and less effective than on days when they had slept 7 or more hours. The effect was not trivial. The difference in leadership effectiveness ratings between well-slept and sleep-deprived managers was large enough, Barnes calculated, to account for meaningful differences in team performance and, ultimately, in the career trajectories and compensation of the managers themselves. Other studies by Barnes and his collaborators found that sleep deprivation reduces the quality of negotiation outcomes. Sleep-deprived negotiators were less effective at claiming value, more likely to accept the first offer, less creative in finding mutually beneficial solutions. Given that salary negotiations, business negotiations, and contract negotiations are among the most financially consequential interactions that most people have in their working lives, this finding has direct financial implications. The entrepreneurial evidence is equally striking. A study of venture capital pitches, one of the highest stakes financial communication contexts that exists, in which the quality of a founder's presentation can determine whether they receive millions of dollars in funding, found that founders who had slept less than 6 hours in the previous 48 hours were rated significantly lower by investors on dimensions of confidence, coherence, and persuasiveness. The ideas were identical. The business models were identical. The only difference was the sleep state of the person presenting them. Sleep had become a competitive advantage in one of the most competitive arenas in the economy. The other side of the relationship, the effect of wealth on sleep, is where the story becomes most relevant to the financial inequality question. The data here is consistent across multiple countries and multiple measurement approaches. Wealthier people sleep longer and sleep better. The American Time Use Survey, which has collected data on how Americans spend their time since 2003, consistently shows that higher-income households report more sleep and better sleep quality than lower-income households, even controlling for age and health status. A large-scale analysis of sleep data from wearable devices, conducted by researchers using data from Fitbit devices worn by hundreds of thousands of people, found that the correlation between income and sleep quality was robust across geographic regions, age groups, and genders. The wealthy sleep better. The question is why, and whether the relationship is causal in both directions. The mechanisms by which poverty and financial insecurity impair sleep are multiple and well documented. Financial stress activates the cortisol system that we have discussed extensively in this series, and elevated cortisol levels in the evening are one of the most reliable disruptors of sleep onset and sleep quality. The hypervigilance produced by chronic financial insecurity, the state of scanning for threats, of being unable to fully relax because the environment feels unsafe, is neurobiologically incompatible with the parasympathetic nervous system dominance that restful sleep requires. People who are worried about money lie awake running numbers, rehearsing conversations, anticipating problems. The cognitive content of financial worry is almost perfectly designed to prevent sleep. Physical environment matters too. Wealthy people sleep in quieter, darker, more temperature-controlled environments. They are less likely to be sharing bedrooms with multiple family members. They are less likely to live in neighborhoods where external noise, safety concerns, or the schedules of economically necessary night work disrupt sleep. They are less likely to be working multiple jobs with inconsistent schedules that make regular sleep timing, which is crucial for circadian rhythm maintenance, difficult to achieve. Every one of these environmental factors is downstream of financial resources, and every one of them has measurable effects on sleep quality. The result is a compounding dynamic that mirrors the scarcity trap and the loneliness cycle that we have discussed in previous videos. Financial insecurity impairs sleep. Impaired sleep impairs financial decision-making, productivity, negotiation effectiveness, and leadership quality. These impairments worsen financial outcomes. Worse financial outcomes deepen financial insecurity, which further impairs sleep. The cycle operates quietly, below the level of most financial advice, reinforcing itself with biological reliability. The wealth-sleep gap has grown in recent decades in ways that parallel the growth of wealth inequality itself. A 2022 analysis of longitudinal sleep data in the United States found that the gap in sleep duration between the highest and lowest income quintiles has widened significantly since the mid-2000s, the same period in which income inequality has accelerated most rapidly. This is not a coincidence. The financial insecurity associated with stagnant wages, rising housing costs, reduced job security, and the erosion of employer-provided benefits produces chronic stress that has chronic effects on sleep. And chronic effects on sleep produce chronic effects on the cognitive capacities that determine financial outcomes. The inequality writes itself into bodies, into nervous systems, into the architecture of sleep, and from there into the next round of economic outcomes. What, practically, can a person do with this knowledge? The first and most important thing is to take sleep seriously as a financial variable, not just as a health variable. The cultural narrative around sleep, particularly in professional and entrepreneurial contexts, has for decades valorized short sleep as a marker of dedication and productivity. The 4-hour sleep schedule of the high-achieving executive has been presented as aspiration rather than pathology. The research is unambiguous that this narrative is wrong. The people who sleep 4 hours are not performing at 4-hour plus extra output levels. They are performing at 4-hour levels while believing, due to the metacognitive impairment that sleep deprivation produces, that they are performing normally. They are making worse decisions, negotiating worse outcomes, leading less effectively, and building less wealth than they would be making with adequate sleep, and they cannot tell. The second practical implication is that interventions to improve financial outcomes that do not address sleep are operating with one hand tied behind their back. A person who is chronically sleep-deprived cannot fully benefit from financial education, financial therapy, or financial planning, because the cognitive substrate on which these interventions depend is compromised. Sleep is not a luxury to be addressed after the financial problems are solved. It is a prerequisite for solving them. This reordering of priorities is uncomfortable because it suggests that some of the most important financial work happens not at a desk or a spreadsheet, but in a bedroom, at the biological level, in the 8 hours that financial culture has traditionally treated as time stolen from productive endeavor. The third implication connects this video to the broader argument of this series. The psychology of money is not separate from the biology of money. The decisions that determine financial outcomes are made by brains that are embodied, that are subject to hormonal states and sleep pressure and social needs and inherited patterns of stress response. The standard model of financial decision-making, the rational actor who calmly evaluates options and selects the optimal one, is not just an idealization. It is a description of a well-slept, low-cortisol, socially connected person operating from a position of financial security. For everyone else, which is to say, for most people, the biology intervenes. The nervous system has its own logic, and financial outcomes reflect that logic as surely as they reflect anything that happens in a spreadsheet. Sleep more, not as a wellness aspiration, as a financial strategy. The research, at this point, is robust enough to say that with confidence.